Welcome to the OK Guard Show. I'm Leanna Maschino, and my co-host, Staff Sergeant Brian Schroeder, is currently at annual training, so you just get me this time. In this episode, we talk effective leadership, both how to effectively be led and how to effectively lead. The interview was with Brigadier General Louis Wilham. He's the Assistant Adjutant General for the Oklahoma National Guard on the Army side. And he has a wealth of experience and knowledge in leadership since he has climbed through the ranks during his more than 30 years of service. So, excellent episode. We hope you enjoy, so let's get to it. Sir, just kind of introduce yourself. We've already established your rank and name and things like that, but talk about your title and what it is that you do for the Guard.
Okay, so actually just right now I'm hitting my 3-year anniversary back as a traditional guardsman. So when I pinned on as a Brigadier General, I took on the role as the Assistant Adjutant General for the Oklahoma Army National Guard. And in that role, I left the AGR program and went over to be a state employee now. So in my role as the Assistant TAG, basically I fill in when the Adjutant General needs me to do things for him, obviously. And on my full-time side for the state, I'm the Executive Director of the Oklahoma Military Department. And that's the state side of how we run things for the National Guard.
Perfect. So Brian and I thought you were a perfect person for this interview. You've had a lot of experience and grown up in the Guard. You've had family who's in the Guard, and you have a lot of leadership experience, and that's why we wanted to have you come on the show. So
exactly. And today our topic, how to be an effective non-toxic leader, is something that is very important for people to recognize, I feel like. Some people may be down a path that they realize that maybe their leadership style has gone for the worse, or maybe somebody is being led by somebody that has these types of toxic leadership traits. So we want to kind of examine a little bit of those and figure out what we can do to maybe adjust course or start off on the right path for some of those new people that may be second lieutenant PFC that are looking to join the ranks and make it up through the ranks, much like you have.
Okay.
So, just a very basic question. Why do you think we need leadership in the military and the civilian world?
Well, it's kind of a broad question, obviously, but leadership's important. Obviously, if we don't have any leadership, we're going to look at kind of anarchy, I guess, would be one way to look at it. But I think leadership provides it turns vision and ideas into action. So I think that's a key, especially on the military side.
how would you categorize types, both good and bad leadership?
Yeah, so we've gone through this. I did when I was kind of preparing for this, I took a look and I just did a quick search on Amazon under leadership books, and I think there's 60,000 different titles for leadership.
Wow. Yeah.
And then when you can look up toxic leadership too, and there's a few hundred titles on that. So this isn't anything new that we're trying to deal with here. And obviously the Army, one of the things that we take away on the Army side is that leadership is one of the most important things that we have. And we do a pretty good job of trying to define what that is and trying to teach young leaders at all levels, either NCOs or officers, how to come up and do that properly. We've had issues in the past, I think, and that's an ongoing problem, not just in the Guard, but in the Army as a whole and really in society. So I think we're getting there. Things change over time, but I think basically those same tenets hold true. And I think you're looking at character traits like, in my opinion, the things that you need to be a good leader, you need to have core values. You need to lead from those values. You need to be a standard bearer. You need to be an empathic leader. You need to have empathy for both the people that you're leading and your customers or the people that you're trying to do things for. And then and empowerment. We want to empower the people that we're leading to do their own thing. So,
How long have you worn the uniform, sir? How long have you served?
So it'll be 32 years a little bit later this year. So.
Wow. It's a long career spanning 3 decades, more than 3 decades.
Yeah, thanks for that.
Very impressive. That's very impressive. So you've encountered many different types of leaders, I'm sure, within your military career. Tell us a little bit about some of those types of leaders and specifics on what made them a good leader, or what stood out to you, whether it be positive, negative, or just neutral.
Sure. Like I said, I'm proud to be flipping back over to a traditional guardsman now at the end of my career. So I did 10 years as a traditional guardsman on the front side as well. So So start with, let me go back to a bad leadership example. And that bad leadership example was one that I had in my civilian career when I worked at UPS, actually. And there was a supervisor that I had who literally took joy in saying no to everything you might ask. Did not empower his employees, took credit for things that they did, and then shifted blame to them when things went wrong that were his fault. So that's kind of the thing that I saw from the civilian standpoint. And I also had some great leaders at UPS as well. But that's the one example of literally the worst leader that I had. And then flipping to that, when I came over on the AGR side, on the military side for the Oklahoma Army National Guard, my first full-time supervisor was Colonel Arnold Moncrief, and probably the best boss I've ever had, and one of the best leaders I've ever had an opportunity to work with. People did things for Colonel Moncrief because they didn't want to disappoint him. They didn't want to let him down. And I think I learned quite a bit from him on that. He operated within our values, and from that set of values, he let people know what he expected. He supported them. He empowered us to make decisions and work on our own. And then the biggest thing that I learned, and I've tried to take with me, I think, is you can do all those things and you can still have a good time in the workplace. As far as, you can smile, you can joke around, you can be happy as long as you're getting the job done. So,
do you think that from your UPS boss that you said was the worst that you've had and the best that you've had, do you think you've learned an equal amount from both on how you want to be as a leader?
Yeah, I think so. From the bad example, it's pretty simple. When you're working with somebody like that specifically, and they're your supervisor, you can see things, and I think you can go in two directions. You can either look at that and go, okay, if this is the way that things need to be done to be successful, that's what I'm going to do, which I think is a really bad idea. But I think we do see some of that. Throughout my career in the Oklahoma Guard, we've seen people who, I don't want to necessarily say they're toxic, but maybe their leadership style was such that people looked at working for them as a badge of honor. Well, I was able to work for so-and-so, and I didn't get fired, and I survived, and I moved on.
Right.
That's really not what I wanted to do. And so I think that's kind of what I saw from that early experience. And so you learn quite a bit from that. On the positive side, again, it's you emulate those things that you perceive as successful. At the time, Colonel Moncrief was extremely successful. There weren't, but I think, one or two AGR 06s in the whole state, and he achieved that level. So obviously it was somebody I aspired to be like, not because of the rank that he achieved, but because of the way he treated people.
Okay.
So do you think that it's genetic to be a good leader? Is that something that you're born with? Is it something that you can learn? Is it maybe a little bit of both?
I think that's that's always that question: are leaders born or made? And I think you can go to any grade school or junior high or high school and see somebody, a child even, who just other people just cling to and watch. And so obviously I think at that level those people tend to be extroverts, and children are kind of they're just kind of waiting to see somebody jump out and take the lead. Whether or not they turn into good leaders in the future, I don't know. So, but I do think that there are certain traits that people are just born with, and and they're going to have an advantage. But I also think that leadership can be taught, and we try to do that in the military, in all branches of the military, and really you see that in industry as well, in private industry. They'll have mentorship programs and programs where they try to bring people in to lead. So, I think it goes both ways, but it surely can be taught.
Okay.
You talked about what an effective leader needs. So if you were to build your perfect effective leader that's both a good leader and respected overall, what traits would you give that person?
Yeah, so the biggest thing for me, and it goes back to those core values that we have as an organization. So on the Army side, it's, we have the acronym leadership: loyalty, duty, respect, selfless service, honor, integrity, and personal courage. Those things are extremely important for me, and I think for all of us. On the Air Force side, it's a little simpler. There's only 3 for whatever reason, but it's integrity first, service before self, and excellence in all we do. Okay. I think if you start with that's your key. You have to have those as a good leader, regardless of if you're a squad leader, a team leader, or battalion or brigade commander. You've got to start with those values. And I think from that standpoint, then, it's can you communicate what your intent is? And so if you have those strong values and you can communicate what your intent is, and then you empower your folks to make those decisions at their level, and that's where those are the big three things, I think. You have to be values driven, you have to be able to communicate your intent, and then you have to empower your folks below you.
I'm going to go off a script just a little bit. You talk about empowerment. How do you empower someone?
Yeah, so empowerment is extremely important, and I'll tell you, I'm gonna read a little bit from. I talked about how the Army in general really tries to focus on leadership, and so I think it's 2012 document, the Army Doctrine Publication ADP 6-0, and it's about mission command, and I'll just read it verbatim. Mission command is the exercise of authority and direction by the commander using mission orders to enable disciplined initiative within the commander's intent to empower agile and adaptive leaders in the conduct of unified land operations. Now, so what the hell does that
So now if you're
Right.
talking to your
Army
grandma. Yeah.
So the point in reading that is the Army spends a lot of time in developing these methods, and a lot of times I laugh. The Army's been around a long time. If you follow their guidelines, typically you're going to be okay, but that stuff's really hard to filter through. But what it really comes down to is General Dempsey was the driver behind this, and he had three basically principles, and those were commander's intent, mission type orders, and decentralized execution. So that's a little bit better. So that what I talked about was commander's intent, was being able to communicate what the mission is. The mission type orders, that's just fragos and op orders, etc. The decentralized execution piece is where we get into the empowerment part. So it's real simple. If I can tell you what my intent is, and then let you at your level execute that intent, then I've empowered you to do your job. Now, the bad part of that is if I'm the type of leader who's a micromanager, I'm going to tell you what my intent is, and then I'm going to follow you every step of the way. And when you start making decisions, I'm going to say, well, I don't want you to do it that way. I want you to do it this way. Or if I'm a bully and I tell you to execute my intent, and you go off and execute the intent, and it fails for whatever reason, and I just lambaste you and embarrass you in front of your peers, then that's not effective either. And so there's a lot of things that come into that. So the empowerment piece, there's a lot of trust that has to be built. I have to make sure that you know what my intent is, and based on the level of leadership and organization we're at, I give you left and right limits, tell you what my intent is, and then I expect you to execute that in accordance with whatever level you are at in the organization. Takes a lot of trust, and it's actually pretty hard too. I mean, it's easy to micromanage. It's hard to give people guidance and let them go.
There's this idea that trust can be done in two ways, whether it's earned or you automatically give someone trust, and then it's like giving them rope, giving them slack. What is most effective? Because trusting immediately, I feel like, is a quicker, more effective way, but there's also more risk. So which side of the...
Well, so one thing I love about the Army is that we have a hierarchy. So when you start out in the Army, you don't start out as a PFC working directly for a brigade commander as one of his staff personnel. You're a part of a team. So at that E5 level, when your team leader tells you to do something, his or her team members, those 5 people, should be able to do anything he tells them to do, or she tells them to do. And so when I get somebody, if I get an E7 that comes and works for me and I'm a company commander, I should expect that E7 has all the tools and all the skills and all the requirements that he or she has to have to execute whatever I tell them to do. Now, there may be some idiosyncrasies about the unit that he or she is in, but basically an E7 should be able to do E7 work. And if even if you're brand new to me, I should be able to tell you my intent and expect you to get it done. And so that's the good thing about the military. It's one of the things we talk about on motivational leaders. I think there's a difference between a leader and a speaker. The Army has a really good way of making sure that your span of control is not too much. As a company commander, you're going to have 3 or 4 platoons. Your focus should be on those platoon leaders. You need to lead those platoon leaders. Let them lead their platoons. Each platoon's going to have 4 or 5 squads. Each squad leader is going to have a couple of teams. We do that on purpose to make sure that this gets driven down. The company commander doesn't have to literally lead every one of his 178 people or 200 people. I mean, effectively he or she does, but he has folks to do that. And I apologize for saying he all the time. That's just typically how we do things. So as a brigade commander, I might have 5 battalions. I don't necessarily need to be able to stand up there and give a hoorah speech to the whole battalion and get them fired, or the whole brigade to get them fired up. The people that can do that, God bless them, because they're much better at that than I am. I'm better at being able to talk to my direct reports in kind of a smaller setting, tell my focus and what my intent is, and try to motivate them to then do that for their folks. The people who can stand up in front of those large groups, some of those people are both excellent leaders and great motivational speakers. Sometimes they're just great motivational speakers, and they might be toxic or kind of a mess when they get down to the lower levels.
Right. Perfect.
So you've kind of described a few different types of leaders, some positive and negative. So what does somebody do to find their leadership style? If you're a new E5 or even a E4, E3 wanting to get to that level, or you're just recently commissioned and you've got a bunch of people under you and you don't know what to do, other than reading a lot of self-help books, how do you recommend one going out and trying to find their leadership style?
Beware of the self-help books. I mean, I was laughing as I was getting ready to come over here. I glanced down. There's a leadership book holding up my screen on my computer. So I mean, it just kind of depends. Some of them are useful and some of them are not. Like I said, there's 60,000 titles out there. Basically, it's pretty simple. It's trial and error. The Army or the Air Force or the Navy or the Marine Corps, we don't commission you or make you an NCO and immediately put you in charge of a large formation and give you a huge undertaking to go through. Sometimes in combat, you see that happen in combat, but typically we kind of bring you along slowly into that process. So it's literally a trial and error. When you start out at a younger level in the military, you'll try different things, and some things will work and some things won't. Great example of that for me is, as I mentioned, I prefer smaller groups. So when I became a battalion commander, I did try to do that hoorah, large formation type speech. It pretty much fell flat. So not my style. Mm-hmm. And so I took that. Again, one of the things I talk about is self-awareness. You need to be a little bit aware of what your capabilities are, what your strengths and weaknesses are. That was not a strength of mine. So I didn't do that again. And so it was actually at an AT period. So I throttled back, refocused my efforts on my staff and my company commanders, and things worked out much better.
How did you learn, like, okay, that fell flat? Was it your peers or your subordinates saying, hey, sir, or could you just tell? Like,
it's literally self-awareness of
okay.
looking out at the audience and a look of bewilderment, because a lot of those folks knew me, but I had never tried that before.
Right.
And so it was just I think most people would love to be able to be that person that stands up there and addresses that large crowd and gets people cheering.
The Independence Day speech where
absolutely.
Everyone's pumped. Yeah, okay.
It's just not me. I'm a better writer than a speaker, so I always typically have notes or crib sheets, something like that. And so that's that self-awareness piece. You just got to figure that out. And I've got a list of some tips, and that's one of those tips. You got to know your strengths and weaknesses, and sometimes it takes a while to figure that out. And one of the hardest things I have for people to understand is that we're all on a bell curve. So General Thompson's got 6 general officers. You put us on a bell curve. There's 2 at the top, 2 at the bottom, and 2 in the middle. Now the 2 at the bottom, they still might be better than any of Arkansas's generals or California's generals, but for his group, they're still at the bottom. And so you got to be aware of kind of where you are on that hierarchy, at least have an idea. We talk about OERs and NCOERs, how they're all overinflated. If everybody thinks they're in the top 10%, then there's probably a problem. So it's really difficult sometimes to look inside and see where you really are on that bell curve.
So using that same analogy, if you are at the bottom of the bell curve, you're new in, and I'm not just talking general level,
sure,
but just everybody. How do you get that experience to get to that mid part of the bell or the top of the bell curve? You force yourself out there. You demand people listen to you. Do you bully your way in, like you were saying? Do you lead from the back? Do you lead from the front? How does one get experience as a leader to figure out how to shape their leadership style?
Yeah, it's actually easier at the lower level. So when you're a company commander, if you get an OER that says you're not a great company commander, I mean, because it's simple. If your brigade commander's got 15 companies, somebody's going to be in the bottom 2 or 3, and I think at that point you have some decisions to make. You're either gonna continue on and do this, or you're gonna just call it in. And so, like I said, you can teach this stuff. And so the problem is, sometimes folks are a little bit hesitant to reach out to their immediate superiors and ask for some mentorship. And so we've typically done a bad job of maybe masking some of that poor performance by saying, OERs will come out and say, you're fine. But in reality, behind closed doors, people will say that officer isn't really that great.
Right.
So that you have to be able to reach out and ask for mentorship. We have the 360 peer evaluations. We're supposed to do those anyway. So you can reach out. You can list all your fellow company commanders and have them do those peer evaluations, and you can see where you stand among their level. But it's really then a matter of self-improvement. We offer schools. We offer you can find the mentorship piece, but it really then it is incumbent upon them. If you have a good mentor, oftentimes I've been able to mentor folks, and I've been able to give them some guidance. These are some schools you need to have. You need to step back out of command and take a staff position and do some things like that. I will tell you the key on that leadership piece at the younger level is, regardless of what position you're in, is to work your tail off in that job. Because you all have seen this. How do we reward hard work? With more work. Mm-hmm. And so if you're doing a good job in the job that you're doing, we're gonna then give you more responsibility and then more projects to work on. And eventually, those projects are gonna be, you're gonna be leading more people when those projects. And so if you do a good job, you're gonna get more work, and then you're gonna get more responsibility. So.
Okay.
Fun. That's always the best part.
Working for more work.
No.
Well, yeah.
But it's a compliment.
Right.
Even if.
It is, and I'll give you a great example, and I'll throw his name out there. This Friday, we're going to promote Lars Ostervold to full bird colonel up in Broken Arrow. Lars is one of our few traditional officers who has a normal job working for a company that's not government related. I mean, technically his company is government related, but it's a private company that he works for. He was a battalion commander for, I think, 5+ years. While he was a battalion commander, we sent him to the War College in distance learning mode, which is much harder than the mode I got to go to. And then, so he's a battalion commander. We're making him do the War College. And oh, by the way, he's got a full-time civilian job. He's responsible for a lot of stuff. That's a perfect example. Hey, you're doing a great job as a battalion commander. We think you have a great future. Oh, by the way, here, take on this 2-year project of doing the War College while you're doing that. And so it's a good example. He's a great leader. He's a great officer. He's got great potential. But we rewarded him by forcing him to stay in battalion command and doing the War College. So
on the mentality side of that, I assume someone would need to see that as, rather than more work is being piled on me, it's more of as a good leader, they see trust in me. Mm-hmm. They want me to help build this particular thing or these many things because they have trust in me. Is that the right mental state to go with on that?
Yeah, I think so. But you also, and again, I think he would have had the trust. They don't know necessarily, but you also can sometimes say, this might be too much. And that's where our fear is, I think, going forward in the Guard. We've talked about an operational reserve versus a strategic reserve. Mm-hmm. And we are asking an awful lot of our traditional men and women to do what we ask them to do. It's becoming really tough. And so you take somebody that has that mentality of no fail, and it's really difficult for them to step up and say, hey, sir or ma'am, I'd prefer to delay this until I come out of command, or I really can't do this, my home life, my work, and everything at once. So, again, that comes back to that self-awareness. If he or she thinks they can do it, it may be some short-term pain, but there's going to be some long-term gain. So it's just individual.
Did you hear about the $20,000 reenlistment bonus? Check your eligibility by contacting the Oklahoma National Guard Education and Incentives Office. Contact information is in the show notes. Now back to the show.
When you first commissioned, I won't say how long ago, we've already discussed this, but when you first started out, the Army, the military as a whole was completely different. Leadership styles, they're kind of generic styles that will carry out throughout time. However, the main style may be different than how it is today, you being at the top levels of leadership here in the Oklahoma National Guard. How do you see that progressing for future generations? For someone that's a second lieutenant, when they get to your level, maybe get your crystal ball and see where you predict leadership styles changing or drifting towards, or does it stay the same?
Yeah, I think, style probably stays the same. I mean, things are gonna morph a little bit, but when you look back throughout history, the successful military leaders are probably all very similar. We talked about how some can be somewhat toxic. I think toxic leaders can get stuff done over the short period of time. It's just that they cause a lot of damage in getting that done, and they're typically not going to be successful for a long period of time. So if I need to do something today, right now, I can force you guys to do whatever I want because of my rank, but that's not going to last. I can't, and I wouldn't do that. But it's just not something that's going to last. On the generational thing, when I got in, it was a lot different. There were no emails. We literally, everything was communicated by memorandum or a face-to-face conversation. So things were a lot different. And so when I see the current, and first off, I would say, gets people in trouble by stereotyping a generation. I'm technically a Gen X person, but I'm at the very early end of the Gen X, and I have a lot more in common with the younger part of the baby boomer generation. The millennial generation today that gets a lot of bad publicity for whatever reason, they span from 22 to 37. There's a huge difference between a 22-year-old recent college graduate and a 37-year-old single mother of 2 kids. I mean, that's so to paint them all with the same brush is a little bit ridiculous.
Sure.
But I will tell you, maybe not just millennials, but just people today in general, their communication style is completely different. We shifted from a face-to-face or memo-driven way to do business. Then we went to emails. Everything was done by emails. Today, nobody even wants to read an email. It's text message. And a lot of folks don't like to communicate verbally, either on the phone or in person. They would love to just be able to do everything by text. That's very efficient for some things, like when you're doing a convoy. If you hit an RP or an SP, you can send a text message, date and location or time and location. But for communicating orders or some things like that, sometimes that's a little difficult. So for the younger generation, they're going to have to be willing to kind of meet in the middle. I think they need to be able to communicate a little bit more face-to-face or on the phone, verbally. And then for the older generation, they need to understand that these folks don't like doing that. So when we can have new technologies or new things that allow them to just send information, they can do that without having to speak face-to-face.
So it's a meet in the middle for both. Both have to sacrifice what they prefer in order to be most effective?
Yeah, I think so. And part of that is a lot of things go like that. When you're in certain roles, you can do certain things. When you're a staff officer, maybe you can rely more on text messaging or emails or traffic that's not as important. When you're a commander, I think there's a requirement to do some of that face-to-face. When you're a first sergeant, obviously you have to do some face-to-face stuff. So it kind of depends on your role.
What do you think the military is doing to adapt to the generation, the technology and all that stuff? And what do you also think they should do to adapt and be most effective?
Yeah, I think obviously I think some of the concerns is that we recruiting is a big key. How do we get in front of people to get our message out there, especially in the National Guard? I mean, I'm an early riser, so I'm typically up at 5 or before, and I listen to sports radio a lot, and so I hear public service announcements about the National Guard at 5:04 in the morning. I'm not sure that that's reaching our target audience. There's just been a recent change. There's talk they're kind of changing up our branding for the recruiters. It looks more like the Army's branding. They're trying to figure out ways to get in there to speak to that younger generation. From a leadership standpoint, I think it goes back to human nature. You see a lot of businesses that can get young people to respond and perform very well in a customer service focused orientation. Chick-fil-A is a great example. Everybody loves to go to Chick-fil-A. Is because those young people that work there, they're very friendly, they're very customer focused, and they're able to push that company's values for the people that come in there and eat.
It's a pleasure to serve you. Yeah.
Yeah.
Every time.
And so
your chicken's great.
if they're able to do that with high school and young college kids, then why shouldn't we be able to do that as well?
Right.
And so I think the Army has done a good job of looking at things like that from the civilian world and how they're doing those things.
Okay. Perfect. That was an awesome answer, because that's something that is just, I wouldn't even know where to start to bring that, but you bridged that very nicely on.
And anybody that works for me is they'll know that they've got the customer service speech.
Yeah.
And customer service is huge, because especially on the full-time side of what we do, we all have customers, whether that's customers at the higher level. One of my customers is the TAG. My other customers in my job are legislators, citizens of the state of Oklahoma, the governor, etc. So I've got to keep them happy, but I've also got customers from the bottom side. My state employees that come up, the soldiers that I deal with, the airmen that I deal with, they're also customers. And so the customer service piece of what we do is huge. And I did much of my career has been in the HR field, and obviously we have customers there. And but you can figure out, regardless of what even an infantry company commander has customers. That's going to be his battalion commander and the people that he is working with. And so you just got to figure out what that customer base is, and you've got to make sure that they're being taken care of.
Yeah, it's a really good analogy. A lot of people don't think of customers in the military.
Sure.
But everywhere you go, you're essentially selling something, selling yourself, selling an idea that you may have that you want to bring to your squad leader, company commander, whatever it may be, on changing things. So knowing how to approach that situation is ideally customer service.
Yeah. And so if you ask, I think right now, obviously, I think the number one priority we have is strength. And so retention and recruiting are huge right now. Well, it's a lot easier to retain a soldier than it is to recruit one and train them up and get them in the formation. So on the retention side of the house, customer service is huge. And so if we have a MUTA 8, but that Thursday, Friday piece is during finals week, if our customers are our soldiers and they can't miss those classes, then we have to use some common sense and step in and say, okay, we have to have a little more leeway for our college students or for those people who are going through some things at work. Maybe they can't come on Thursday and Friday because they just got promoted into a new job. So that's just a really simple way of figuring out who your customers are.
So that bridges us, I think, really nicely into understanding your employees or your customer's personality, and how to work directly with them so that you can come up with something that's the most effective possible, whether it's a project or whatever. So how important is it for leaders to understand how their employees perceive information, to get them to execute the way you want? Because some are extrovert, some are introvert. I gave the example of maybe a boss's delivery method would really motivate and pump someone up, and then the other person would be like just completely shut down by it. So how important is it to know the difference?
Well, it's critical. And again, that's where, don't overthink this, because again, if you look at it from a direct report standpoint, yes, a company commander's got 170 to 200 people. He doesn't need to communicate with each of those people individually. He can address the company and say things in front of the whole company, but that's not where it's going to drive the train on getting whatever it is you said done. What's going to get that done are the squad leaders. And so those squad leaders need to know who those folks are. Apologize about
No worries.
that. Forgot to turn that off. So those squad leaders are the ones who are going to need to communicate those things down at that lowest level. And so in my job now, I have 6 direct reports. Every one of those people is different. They have different things that drive them. There are different reasons they work for me, and there are different reasons that they come to work. I know what motivates each of those people, and I treat them each differently when I have to give them taskers and do those things. A first sergeant's going to be the same way. His platoon sergeants, he's going to know each of those folks individually. He's going to know what motivates him or her to do certain things. So it's critical. You've got to be able to do that.
Does that take quite a bit of time to learn?
From a traditional soldier or officer standpoint, it probably seems like it takes a ton of time, and that's why you need to do things like you need to meet, before or after drill, and just have some discussions about just what's going on. Our director of the Joint Staff, General Harrison, has recently implemented basically it's like a weekly half-hour time to sit down with his direct reports, and he just visits with them. Obviously, a lot of that's about work, but a lot of that is also about, hey, what's going on? Tell me what's going on. John has way more direct reports than I do, and that fills up his calendar. But for our normal span of control between 5 and 8 people, I think that's pretty easily done.
Yeah, that brings us to toxic leadership. We've talked a little bit about, just touched on examples of toxic leadership. You mentioned the bully. There's a dictator, micromanager, the autocrat, stressed. Some people may find their leadership to be incompetent, just based on perception. So how and why do these types of leadership negatively affect the workplace? I mean, it may be kind of a very general, obvious question.
Yeah, I mean, it seems obvious, but General Milley, I hope it wasn't in a non-attributional format, but he said the reason we still have toxic leaders around is because sometimes toxic leaders get the job done. And so I think that's what we have to really watch out for. It's like I said earlier, a toxic leader can work in the short term. We can force people to do things in a very short amount of time. Sometimes when you see things, and because of the nature of our business, sometimes those are the things that get highlighted in a person's career. When we were deployed, we did this. When we were at an AT period, he or she did this, and they got results. Well, yeah, that might have been great for that operation on that day, and that might have worked. But for the long-term ability to get things done, that's probably not going to happen. So the toxic leadership piece is tough. And so when people say things like, toxic leaders get the job done, that's not necessarily true. They might get a task done, but they don't necessarily get the job done. So that's what we have to look out for. I think the key is that our senior leaders need to make sure that they're not rewarding toxic leadership. We've seen it, and so it's not funny. I mean, I've seen people berate people in public, and then other people kind of laugh it off. That needs to be addressed, because that's not something that is in line with our Army values. And I mean, we teach that you should praise in public and punish in private. And so we need to make sure that when we see that, we need to call out our peers for allowing that to happen. And then if you're a subordinate and you see a superior do that, you need to get behind closed doors and call that out and make sure that gets addressed.
If you're the actual, so we go into if you're a soldier, airman, or an employee in the civilian workforce, and you are in an environment where it's toxic, you have a leader that is just a nightmare to work for, at what point should they say something, and how should they communicate? Is it through their chain of command, HR, or is it directly with the leader? How would you? Yeah,
of course, that kind of depends on what. In my opinion, it depends on what it is. So if it's something that's discriminatory or a harassment type issue, like sexual harassment or harassment that falls into any of those categories that we talk about, the first thing you need to do is tell the person that says something to you that, I don't appreciate you speaking to me that way, that you shouldn't talk to me that way. Now, if it's a military instance where it's not based on a harassment type issue like gender, sexual, or things like that, then it becomes a chain of command issue. If you're a specialist and some company commander is just ripping you in front of a bunch of people, it becomes really difficult for you to say, "Sir, I don't appreciate you talking to me like that." But then they do have the chain of command. So then you would go to your platoon sergeant and you would go to your first sergeant. And if you don't get relief from that, or if or maybe they can explain to you why this person did that, and then you can accept that explanation. But if that's not valid for you, then we have other chains. You can talk to the chaplain, or you can talk to the IG, or even talk to a JAG if it raises to that level. And I will tell you that since I've been in a, quote, senior leadership role from the 05 level and above, we take those things very seriously and we look into them. So, and obviously the person that's involved might be concerned about retribution, but we keep a close eye on that as well. So
Yeah, because if you're in a toxic environment and you're being led by a bully, you don't want to stand up and say, excuse me, I don't think this is the right way.
Right.
Because that's going to come back on you,
Sure.
ultimately. So knowing the right channels and the right paths to go is very important, because you can't fight fire with fire in this instance.
No, because the rank still has its privileges.
Exactly.
And so, but that's where it comes into that deal of, hopefully, if you're a leader and that happens to you, when I say leader, I'm talking about NCOs or above, then you have those other mentors you can go to and say, hey, so-and-so said this to me. How do you take this? And then you can kind of bounce those ideas off some other folks as well.
How can you give someone comfort in knowing they have that chain of command? There's not going to be any negative consequences to you coming forward about something. We know sexual assault and harassment and things like that. We absolutely, that is something that people should know. Hey, go to your chain of command. Don't be afraid to do it. And there will not be negative consequences. But what if it's just the way that leader is treating these people? Maybe it's not in a harassment realm, but does that make sense, Mike?
Sure. And I think that's where, like I said, your peers, we do command climate surveys. You can, based on the level of the organization that's happening at, that's kind of where you need to go. The IG is always a good route if you've tried the chain of command. Obviously, typically the IG is going to tell you, have you talked to your first sergeant about this? And what you don't want, or what you hope from our level, what we hope doesn't happen, is that you hope that you don't have a commander and a senior NCO that have that same mindset, because that's when sometimes things can get stopped. And if that's the case, as hard as it is, they need to go outside their immediate chain of command and go to the brigade chain of command or even the state chain of command. I think sergeant majors typically always have an open door policy, and that I know it takes a lot of guts for a soldier to go up to a sergeant major. Officers, we can typically go the XO route, or we can just talk to somebody on that side. So, but it is difficult to get that across, and that's incumbent upon us as senior leaders to ensure that those things don't happen, that retribution doesn't happen, and retaliation doesn't happen.
Okay.
So what about outside of the military? The Guard, it's two hats that we wear. We have civilian jobs and we also have military obligations. The military, it's very kind of straightforward. We have that chain of command and those channels that we can use. What if you have a micromanaging boss in the civilian world? How do you, and they're not harassing, they're just very nitpicky and on you, they give you a task and they just control it the entire way. How do you address a leader that's in that position?
Yeah, it's similar to what we have on the military side. I mean, there are certain things, if it's a hostile work environment, there are things you can do through your HR department. If you just have a bad boss, sometimes you just have a bad boss.
Yeah.
And he or she may have reached that level of supervision. Everybody's familiar with the Peter Principle. And so you get promoted up to your level of where you can't do the job anymore, basically. And sometimes that happens. A person might be a great salesman. They make him a sales manager. He's a horrible sales manager, and we see that quite often. And so that's kind of what you're talking about. Those are tough. And so it would be based off the climate of that specific company. Sometimes the company makes it really easy to kind of counteract that. Sometimes that company does not make it easy to do that. So.
Yeah, because it's hard, because after a while you get tired of nodding and smiling and just saying yes and trying to fulfill a task that will never be fulfilled.
Sure.
How would you, what would you recommend for someone in that position to think of when, hey, you just have a bad boss and you just have to deal with it? You have a mortgage, you have a family to take care of, and you just, I don't want to say stuck, but if they feel that way, what should they do to cope with that?
just go to your happy place.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's one thing. The other thing is to not on that company's clock, but to do a job search and try to find something else. I mean, I know that sounds kind of a flippant answer, but that person should know the values of that company. So if I work for company X and I know and I can see their mission statement and what their core values are, if this supervisor does not have those core values and if he or she isn't leading me in the fashion that supposedly that company is supposed to be living by, well then maybe I have an ability to go around that person and talk. And again, the HR office is extremely important in this instance. You just go talk to the HR person and say, hey, here's what's going on. And you may not be the only person that's gone that route and made those complaints. And so if they get enough of those, then they can act on them. If the company that you're working for doesn't have a mission statement, doesn't have a list of what they value and what they do, then maybe you just need to go find a better job. That I know that seems easy, but maybe you need to find a place that you'll better fit into.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's almost like choosing happiness, because a toxic environment can cause just severe anxiety in someone, and over time that could do harm to them, to their family, any of their friends, loved ones, the work environment.
Yeah. Personal example of my youngest daughter was working for a place. She's married to a Coast Guardsman, and so they moved out of state, and she got a job pretty quickly in this other state. A little bit different job than what she expected, and the company really didn't have the same values that she does, and it was a fairly high-stress position. And so she worked there for 2 years, but it was just eating at her almost every night. And so my suggestion to her was find another job. And she did, and she's in another job now and is much happier. About the same pay, which really wasn't the big deal. I think she would have taken a pay cut to get out of that other environment. That's just a good example. I mean, right now we're fairly lucky that unemployment rate is low, and so I would think that you could find something. It's just, but it's easy for me to say that, but it's extremely difficult to be in that situation. I understand that.
Yeah, but it's also important to, I think, to recognize if it's the boss or if it's you. Are you the one that's having a hard time working for people because you want to be the boss, and since that person that you're working for isn't great, so I'll go find somewhere else to work, versus 2 years is a long time to work for a boss and try different avenues to make it work. And that I think is very important as well, rather than just straight giving up when somebody crosses your path that you don't like.
Yeah. Well, I'll
dedication in there.
Throw something out. I'm almost positive it was Carl Bayer that coined this phrase the other day, because I was talking about this opportunity to come and talk on the podcast, and I said it was about toxic leadership, and we talked about toxic followers. And so, that comes into that self-awareness piece. Don't be a toxic follower. On the military side, it's easy. If it's a legal and lawful order, as bad as it may be, you need to do that. On the civilian side, it's a little different, so you have to be careful on what they're trying to get you to do. But yeah, if you've been unhappy with your last 5 bosses, yeah, it might be you. It might not be the bosses.
Yeah.
And so that's just something to be aware of.
Just go start your own company.
Yeah, exactly.
Work for yourself.
I'm sure a lot of successful people have done that too.
Yeah. How can a leader recognize these traits, these negative traits in themselves, and if they're able to? Is it too late for them to change?
So like a narcissist, where a narcissist is never going to recognize that they're a narcissist, right? This is just part of their traits.
Yeah, something would have huge would have to happen for them to be self-aware that, oh, this is me.
Right.
But if someone has the ability to see that in themselves, like, hey, I just micromanaged my employees for this project.
Or if one of their peers pull them aside and say, hey, the way you handled this, maybe next time.
Yeah, and so I think that's so it's a great point. Yeah, number one, a narcissist probably is never going to do that, and so I think that's close to a mental illness, or a behavioral health issue. So that's something they need to deal with through therapy. But so they're always so self-awareness and self-improvement. So if you truly desire to improve your performance, you can do that, and again, I hate to throw back always to the Army has done this before, but the Army has been around a long time. The Army National Guard obviously has been around even longer, but there's methods for everything. So you have an OER, and I'm going to say on the officer side, you have an OER, you have an OER support form, you have the 360 review. There are plenty of tools that are in place for you to be self-aware of what your performance is. You have your peers, you have your superiors talking to you offline. Hopefully you have a mentor that can talk you through some of this stuff. The Army has put a framework in place. If you follow what the Army tells you to do, you will probably be successful, or at least have a better chance at being successful. Where we get into trouble is, and this is something we need to hold each other accountable for, as well as you guys need to hold each other accountable. You need to be candid and honest on those evaluations. If somebody has some traits that worry you, I know it stings. Nobody likes to be confrontational or put bad comments on an evaluation, but you have to do it, because you have to understand you as a leader aren't necessarily beholden to that subordinate, that single subordinate, but to whoever he or she is commanding.
Yeah.
And so if that person is responsible for a 200-person company, you don't own loyalty to that person. You owe loyalty to the organization.
Right.
And so it's tough, but then you have to be honest and candid with that person. Here's where you've fallen short. And then as a mentor or as a leader, if the person is salvageable, and most people are, then these are the things you need to do to improve. So it can be done. It's just a matter of if they're willing to look at that and if they want to improve.
Yeah.
Sure. Catching it early.
Earlier the better.
Developing those mentors that may see those traits, like you were saying, and help reshape thought process or approach when dealing with other people.
Yeah, and then hopefully we're not rewarding poor performance. When, and again, if the performance piece, if the boss's number one priority is strength, are we going to reward the company commander who saves everybody, but half of them can't pass a PT test and they don't meet the standards, and you've got some folks who are drug abusers and things like that? Or are you going to reward the person who maybe fell a little bit short of meeting their recruiting and retention goals, but their company's clean, their folks pass a PT test, their readiness levels are high? So we as senior leaders need to make sure that we're not rewarding the bad performers on that from that level.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, because when you hear toxic leadership, you think the bully, the micromanager, but you don't necessarily think that, well, all of my people are great, so they all get outstanding reviews.
Yeah.
That in itself is a toxic leader as well, correct?
Yeah. So again, if you look at our values, loyalty is one that people sometimes confuse. I'm not loyal to you. I'm not loyal to John or Jack or Jill. I'm loyal to the organization in the United States of America and the state of Oklahoma. So am I doing what the right thing is for the agency, the organization, and those pieces? And I think some people have misplaced loyalty. They feel loyal to a certain commander or a certain person. That's not what the value of loyalty means.
And that can be difficult in the Guard, because it's a very family-oriented organization.
Sure.
So you may be in the same unit with somebody for your entire career. Active duty is different. You get moved around every 2-3 years, so you don't have that opportunity to build those same strong bonds that you do in the Guard.
Yeah, and I think sometimes we see leaders get into a little bit of trouble where they've done a whole lot of great things for the organization, and then they'll make a mistake later in their career, and people are unwilling to call that person out for that mistake, and so they'll kind of just say, well, he or she has been so great on these other things, we're going to let that slide. And then what that happens is, then some of our younger folks who haven't been with that person for the last 30 or 40 years, all they see is this horrible mistake, and the person doesn't get punished. And so then that sets a bad precedent.
Yeah.
How can you be the type of employee and peer that a leader wants to mentor? Because I imagine there are leaders who are like, these people that I'm leading are just a nightmare to, it's, two-way street. So how can you be an employee and a peer that someone wants to lead?
Yeah, that goes back to the toxic follower comment that I had earlier. And so, I don't know who said this, but basically, 90% of life is showing up. And, and so if people come to work, obviously, be fairly competent at your job, and don't be a jerk. I mean, if you do those three things, you're going to be successful in our organization. And each one of those has a little bit of a different variance of what that counts for. But I mean, it's very, some of the same traits that we look for in leaders are the same things we look for in every employee. Stand by the values, meet the standards, and then when you're given that opportunity, if you have a boss that empowers you to do something, take the reins and go do it. Don't ask for too much guidance and direction, because then you're just asking to be micromanaged.
Yeah.
Most of us don't want to be told what to do every step of the way. We want to be able to give me some direction and then get out of my way.
Yeah.
But not everybody is like that.
All right.
We've all had employees where, man, you give them a task, and if you're not pushing them and pushing them and pushing them, they're just not going to do it. And
Right.
and that's as frustrating as anything else. So
I think we're at, if there's anything you feel that's pertinent to this subject that you would like to add that we may have not covered.
I think, well, first off, I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you guys for having me.
Yeah, thanks for being here.
Yeah, absolutely.
You bet. And I think it's kind of what I can't focus enough. So on our values. In 2000, General Mattis, who was the Secretary of Defense, Secretary Mattis, he came out with, in back-to-back years, he sent a letter to the entire force about ethics. In 2017, he talked about making sure that we stayed in the ethical midfield. So in a football analogy, basically he wants us to run down the middle of the field, not get too close to the sidelines where if we have a misstep, we're out of bounds ethically. And then in 2018, he followed that up with a second letter again to the entire military force that talked about he wants admired leaders who coach and inspire, building a foundation of trust, and then remembering that accountability matters. And so again, this is coming from the Secretary of Defense.
Yeah.
And so he's concerned about our ethical standing, and I think that's something we all need to be concerned about as leaders and as just members of the military in general. We were very fortunate in 2019 to still have the full support of our citizenry. We all get thanked for our service anytime we're in uniform, but it's been almost 20 years since we've been at war, and it's a different type of war than this country's ever seen. And so I think that we have to be very vigilant in maintaining the standards that we expect. And so when I talk about leading from a position of values, that is incredibly important. So our Army values, we have to know what those are, and we have to make sure that everything we do coincides with those Army values. The Air Force's values, again, are simple, and they're out there. Same thing on their front. So if you're making a decision, and if you're trying to lead people, and your decisions and your leadership style or what you're trying to get them to do, if they run counter to those values, then you're wrong. And we need to ensure it going forward that we hold everybody to that standard. That's key.
Great. That's perfect. I, again, think you were the perfect person for this interview. So
Yeah. Thanks again for joining us here. And yeah, this is wonderful. It's a wonderful conversation. I definitely learned a lot about leadership and things to focus on, being self-aware, but also as one that's being led by people too, how I can approach my leadership and what to expect from them and take their guidance, how to take their guidance. So
Great.
yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Sir.
Appreciate it.
Thank
My
you, sir.
honor.
thank you for listening to today's episode. We hope you enjoyed it. I know that Brian and myself got a lot out of the actual interview. Next episode is going to be over TRICARE, and we talk primarily TRICARE Reserve Select for our M-Day soldiers and airmen. A lot of great information, so stay tuned for next month's episode, and it airs on July 17th. So we'll see you then. The OK Guard Show is produced by the Oklahoma National Guard Public Affairs Office. Any mention of products or brands does not imply endorsement. All guests on the show are volunteers in an effort to inform and educate members of the Oklahoma National Guard, their families, retirees, potential recruits, and the community.